Welcome to Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave, where we are on a mission to answer 4 questions from some of the best leaders and leadership minds in the country. So, with that, we are pleased to feature our special guest this episode, Mike Mears. So, Mike, welcome.
Hey, Dave, thank you for having me on.
Hey, thanks for being here. So, give us a little bit about yourself, your background, who you are, what you do, the whole 9 yards.
Well, Dave, if your guests are looking on here, they'll see I'm probably the oldest guest you've ever had. And when you get up to my age, you can have done everything, and I have. So I was a went to West Point for college, and then ended up fighting in Vietnam. And when I left the military, I went back, got my MBA. And then struck out on my own just to start up companies. So I started up multiple small companies. So
Nice.
there I've got military experience, small business experience, and then uh, got involved in the work for Jack Welch in the 90s. And that was the time to work for a big business because
Hmm.
uh, that company was number one. I mean, they were on the cover of every business magazine. And so I learned so much having seen small business and then getting involved in big business and differences in culture and watched how he was able to take a really a very large enterprise and make it work more like a small business.
Yeah.
And then I was, shall we say, got involved with the CIA. And I was in the Directorate of Operations, which is the spy side of the house. Uh,
Cool.
and I'll let your imagination go wild with that. But I also, later, after I got higher rank, Georgetown had asked me to start up a leadership academy at the
Mm,
agency, which I did, uh,
nice.
and ran that. And then later, even later, I rose up to be chief HR or chief human capital at CIA. The great thing with that, Dave, was I was able to pull data of all kinds. I mean, I was in a position where I could gather data on culture, I could gather data on best bosses, worst bosses, what works, what doesn't. So that and the Leadership Academy has really started me down the pike of what asking the question, thinking about it, what is good leadership?
Nice. Well, I was gonna joke with you when you said you could pull all kinds of data. I'm like, well, yeah, you could probably pull data on how I like my eggs over easy in the mornings
Now you remember I was
to a
CIA,
certain degree.
not KGB. I was CIA, so we don't gather data on U.S. sits.
Yeah, I'm sure there's all kinds of data that you have access to. One of the things, two things growing up in Hampton Roads. One, you drove by Cheatham Annex enough to know, like, just don't look that way when you drive past
That's
on
right. Something,
64.
some super secret there. Don't look.
Yeah, like, and the other one is growing up around, Naval Weapons Station Yorktown and the world's largest, NAS Oceana and Norfolk Naval Base, world's largest base, and all this activity that goes on there. You learn a catchphrase, that just kind of took on a life of its own. And if somebody asks you a question, you're just like, I can either confirm or deny the presence of nuclear weapons on the submarine, sir or ma'am, right? That's just the answer for everything. I don't know what you're talking about. So no, I'd love to find out a little bit more about the Leadership Academy because, like I said, going back even further, one, Welch was a rock star at that time,
Yeah,
an
absolutely.
absolute rock star. And it's funny because I remember some critics taking some pot shots, and I didn't really understand what Jack was saying until I mean, I really like it hit me a couple of years ago. But he was always like, all right, every year, bottom 10% gotta go. And everyone's like, oh my God, that's so cruel. And they're like losing
Right.
their mind, right? Well, then because I was digging into some Gallup data, and like I said, this has just been kind of the crux of my business from the last 2 years and really dialing it in over the last 6 to 8 months. But in their state of the workforce reports, they show on average, roughly you got 30 some percent are engaged and 50% are not engaged. But more importantly, you got roughly 16% of the workforce that's actively disengaged,
Yeah.
right? And then completely different set of data, still Gallup, but it's somewhere else. It's like the two aren't in the same report. And this is really where, for me, the synapses weren't synapsing until I finally like put these
Yep.
two pieces of Gallup data together. I'm like, it's one of the old like hit yourself in the forehead. I could have had a V8 moment, right? And it said that the actively disengaged employees cost their employers roughly 34% of their salary annually, right? And so, and I had a friend of mine that worked for Gallup for a long time. He's an organizational psychologist, and he worked with the Q12, and so he was very familiar with that wrap up and how they rolled that up and how they come up with that particular thing. But what got me is that now I took that 16% and thought about how much they're costing and how toxic they are to the culture and the environment. Went back, thought about Jack Welch's statement of get rid of the bottom 10%. Well, the bottom 10% are probably all of your actively disengaged people. Why
Well,
would you not want to get rid of them? Because they're costing the company so money, they're bringing it down, they're causing hate and discontent. I mean, it made perfect sense what Jack said based on the light of Gallup data.
yeah, I think where he could have done a better job was instead of using firing as the way to tweak and improve quality, what he could have done is taken another lesson from Gallup. There's another division of Gallup that does assessments,
Oh yeah,
psychological.
strength finders and
And so he could have used some of the Gallup methods to increase validity of the people he was hiring, so he wouldn't have that issue. So like when I got interviewed at GE, it was really it was almost they were looking to see, are you a type A or not?
right.
You're coming into the management group because the company, the culture was all type A's. And I think his overall style wouldn't work as well today, simply because we've got, virtual work, we got work-life balance, we got a lot of things going on that didn't exist during his era. But there's still a whole lot to learn from the guy. You want a GE story? Here's one when I was
Yeah.
okay. Um, he was, back then the union was at odds with the corporate heads everywhere. So GE was no exception. And Welch had a dinner for a retiring union chief.
Hmm.
And so, it was cordial, and in spite of the previous headbutting, very cordial. They actually gave him the gold watch. You've heard
The
of
proverbial gold watch. Yes,
back in
indeed.
the day. And at the end of it, the union chief got up and started talking, and he gave a really eloquent talk about how much he loved GE, how great the people and employees were, and how much he appreciated for Mr. Welch allowing him to work there. But then right at the end, he looked at Jack Welch and he said, Mr. Welch, for 34 years, you had complete use of my hands. And he paused and he said, if only you had asked, you could have used my head. And I
Mm.
I think that hit Welch right in the middle of the forehead. And that's when he started things like he called it workout, but I call it quick wins, where you get employees together to brainstorm and solve problems.
Yeah.
That's where he started to engage all the brains of the employees instead of just having them sit right there at the top. And after he did that for, gosh, it was about 8 years, then he transitioned into Six Sigma, which again was process improvement, required all the brains of the employees to come up with really great solutions. So, that in one way, that's a definition of leadership. The leader awakens the employees, number one, energizes them, inspires them. Number two, makes use of those brains, because if you've got all these people in an organization, well, why don't you use all the brain power?
Oh, 100%. And that I like that story because, like I said, it just like I say, hits you right between the eyes. It's like, wait a minute, I've got all of this untapped potential sitting here,
Right.
and I for manufacturing it makes perfect sense. But I've healthcare and fire and EMS and more into the lean process improvement, more the actual lean than the Six Sigma itself. And I know a lot of times they
Yeah.
merge together and
Yeah.
they kind of use them together. But I love the concepts of the people that are closest to the problem probably had the best idea of how to fix the problem and getting them involved instead of the CEO being the sage on the stage, right? The one person who has all the ideas where, all wisdom flows from where the oxygen is thin down to everybody else.
You know what? And the funny thing, I like that, Dave, because that gets you back to the old saw that leaders don't know all the answers, but they do know all the questions to ask.
Yes, yes. Well, and that's good. They should know the questions to ask, and they should be good at asking questions. And like I said, you don't I don't say you don't want them to have all the answers, but you shouldn't have all the answers. I mean, it's
Yeah.
you're missing out on a vast amount of viewpoints and variety and things like that. And I think also going back to one thing that you said, I'm a huge fan of exactly what you mentioned as far as using assessment tools to go in and actually because I mean we have a process that we use with different assessment tools here that kind of matches the candidate. It's more candidate selection than recruiting or anything else, but it's like what does the job need, right? And so it's not just a matter of, all right, do I have a type A or a type B? Do I have an introvert or an extrovert?
Right, right.
Somebody who's wound up. It's like, okay, well, what are the five tasks or whatever that you've got to be good at for this job, and then rank them in order. What's most important, least important, and you'll especially appreciate this with HR. It's like the textbook example. Number one thing that is most important is compliance, right? I'm not paying you a salary, so we step in a pile of poo and get $1 million wrongful termination suit, right? That's why we're paying you to make sure we're dotting all our I's and crossing all our T's. But when you take 80% of their week and you assign time frames to it, it might be the most important thing, the most critical thing that they do, but it might only be 2 to 5% of their week that they deal with that.
Yeah.
But when it is, it's the most important, right? It's not the most routine. And yeah, it's funny because in that process from some SMEs, it brings out, hey, here's the top 4 behavioral traits, top 4 drivers, motivators, whatever, top 7 soft skill competencies, workplace competencies. And you can objectively tell it. Trust me, if you spent the money to get all the adverse impact studies done and have it where you're, not just EEOC, but OFFCP compliant, if they give you your seal of approval on your process, you got something good going on. But I'm a big fan of matching, especially the higher up you go in the organization, or even for like a high churn position.
Yep.
Where can you match what's needed for the job to the people that are coming in so they're the best fit for that job?
And it's not pigeonholing people at all.
Mm-mm.
It's just making best use of their talents. Because I'll tell you what, if you gave me a job and I could play to my strengths, I'm going to be very happy.
100%.
When you're playing to a strength, it's something you do well, right? Same
Yep.
thing. And that's a vital component. Here's a piece of trivia for you. I got a
What's
secret.
that?
Are you ready? Who invented psychological assessments or advanced assessments for selecting people?
There's several folks that have been in the mix, but I know William Marston was credited with originally, with the original disc model that a lot of folks and companies have poured on additional research to. But even then, you go back to Socrates in the four.
Uh,
I
I
mean,
didn't.
you
I
can
didn't.
take it way back, but William Marston is the one that's been officially credited with it, even though he was technically working off of he was standing on the shoulders of other giants who had done
Right.
some research, psychological research beforehand.
I like your Socrates answer. The and Marston he did disc, right? Which
Yeah,
is a,
he was the original one for the four factor that turned into disc.
the way the actual use of full scale assessment started was World War II. Uh, OSS, which was CIA's predecessor, was parachuting a lot of people into France. They were called Jedburgh teams, and a lot of people, a lot of these teams were getting broken up because of bad leadership, or people having what they called nervous breakdowns back then under the stress. Or so the OSS or CIA psychologist went to General Donovan in 1943, and they said, Chief, we think if we leave our Jungian baggage and our Freudian baggage at the door, we can get together and we can come up with a way to predict people's future behaviors. It won't be perfect, but we think there is a way to do that. Well, here's what's interesting. Same time they were doing it, the Germans were in a top secret study in Germany, and the Brits were, we didn't know it, but the Brits were working on top secret. So the Brits didn't crack the code. Uh,
Right.
you know why? I mean, it's interesting, just a cultural
How's
thing.
that?
They they saw, well, wait a minute, we're testing, and these commoners sometimes have better leadership attributes than aristocrats. How could that be? Isn't that
Yeah,
funny?
right. How could that be? My God, we can't have
And
these
so the Germans were doing
filthy vermin, running around in charge.
Germans were doing the same thing, and their wheels fell off because, oh my God, how could Jews and Poles and these other people, in many cases, have better leadership attributes than our German group? So they never made it, but the OSS went to a place not far from where you live, actually, um, in Fairfax County, Fairfax Circle,
Mhm.
rented an old estate three weeks later, and hammered it all out. 3 weeks after that, they got the first OSS class to come in, and that was the first assessments applied. So that was top secret until 48, and they applied. Then they went public in a book called An Assessment of Men, men meaning women
Right,
and
right.
women and men. And that's when that industry was so, well, psychologists were blown away. But you mean you can predict future behavior to some extent?
Right.
Um, and so when they published that, it took a long time for the psychological world to digest it. But then way back when IBM started big assessment centers for, caught very expensive. And anyways, come out today to where we've got all these very highly valid instruments, like you mentioned, the Q12. That's an organizational instrument, but you've
Right.
got Strengths Finder, and then you've got off-the-shelf stuff even to look at leadership attributes for people.
Yeah,
Because
and
people
that's the nice.
naturally, natural leaders, the rest of us, and then some people really should never have been leaders. I don't know whether you've had a worse boss.
No. You're absolutely right. And it's almost like, let's just say professional sports.
Yeah,
Okay. There's some people that truly are your Tiger Woods, your Michael Jordans. I mean, they're just literally born with it. But even though they're born with it and they have that innate talent, it's what does it say? Um Training beats talent when talent doesn't train, or something to that effect. It's kind of like,
I,
they still had to put in god awful amount of training and development and coaching and work to take that god-given natural proclivity for their sport. That, I
exactly.
mean, and they got it. I mean, best in the world. But if they had to put in the time and training and effort, they never would have been able to develop it to that level. And you look at a lot of folks that don't have that. There's a lot of professional golfers, a lot of professional basketball players, a lot of professional football players. They're good. They're okay. Like you said, the ones in the middle,
Yeah,
and with the right, I got the attitude, I got the training, I've got put all that into, they can be professional athletes, and they range from your Tom Brady's to I'm on the bench, but they're still professional athletes, right? They're still there. And so you've got kind of these levels. And I think it's the same thing with leadership. You've got, yeah, some folks like, all right, you're 5'2", just like give up that dream of being an NBA star, right? Spud Webb was 5'6", right? He could dunk, right? He was like the anomaly, right? He was the one in a million. But beyond that, you're under 6 foot tall. Just give that dream up, right? So there's certain things that, like, okay, you're just whatever, leave the leadership thing alone. That's not your jam, right? It just isn't. But I think a lot of folks, oh, well, you're just naturally a leader. Well, even the folks that have that natural proclivity to maybe some public speaking skills or some charisma, things that would lend themselves advantageous to leadership. I think they still have to develop those over time, because if you don't, that natural talent is only going to get you so far without the additional development.
Yep. I absolutely think you're right.
Well, it's funny you talk about the assessments, and then we'll get into the first question. And I definitely want to weave some of the other experiences that you had in there. But it's really interesting when you mentioned about, I hear all the time, I don't like to put people in boxes. I don't like assessments because it's putting people in boxes. It's like, stop. If you're using a solid tool,
Right.
and like I said, for me, I this the I have other tools I use, but the main suite of instruments that I use, it took about a year and a half for me to really find a company that I trusted and wanted
Right.
it. And it wasn't how pretty the reports were. It was literally the research department is what sold me on the company. Right,
Hmm.
because of all the, I'm giving them a hard time. A little backstory is I'm giving them a hard time, right? It was about the 15th place I've talked to, right? So I'm, at some point, like, okay, this is the same old, right? But I had a friend of mine that referred me to him and said, this is gold. You got to talk to these people. So I'm kind of being probably more of a jerk than I should have been, honestly. And I'm kind of like, yeah, I talked to my consulting friends, and like they say, none of these things are valid and reliable, and they don't have the juice, whatever. So I heard the lady, well, check your email. Because even we're on the phone, I'm like, what am I checking my email for? Oh, I just sent you the 110-page statistical compendium on 30 years of our validity and reliability studies on these instruments. And I'm like, talk about eating a plate of crow, man. I swear. I looked it up. I'm like, I was looking at the Cronbach's alpha and all the different uh parts, looking at the validity and reliability. I'm like, all right, these guys brought receipts. Like, this is legit. Like, this is the real deal. And that's the stuff that I love working with, is when you have the science behind it, no matter what the instrument is. If you have that with you, then okay, I can put that. And I love telling people, no, it's not putting people in boxes. It's just discovering how people are wired, how they intake and digest information, and if it's a communication behavior, so how they send it back out. But if hey, you're the 3 bullet point kind of guy, and I'm the one that you kind of, hey, how's the wife and kids? How was the soccer? That you kind of,
Right.
the more high S versus the high D. If I know this about my team, how they're wired, then I can actually try to meet them in the middle, and and really try to, it improves communication, it improves a lot of things. Just being able to, I kind of meet you halfway, you meet me halfway, and we understand how each of us are wired and how we come across during stressful situations and probably don't even realize it. And all those things, what really drives and motivates folks. I think once you understand that, especially as a team,
Yep.
it's absolutely amazing. And like I said, and then it's not judgmental, and it's not there's a good or a bad, or there is a good or bad style. It just is. It's just, this is how you're wired, and now you know it. I know what to do to adapt to others, and how to make my situation better. And when you trouble, and it's funny, job placement. I had a friend of mine ran a local manufacturing plant here in the Winchester area, and I always teased them. I was like, they were having like 4 recruiting companies trying to just keep frontline staff there, just like butts in seats, right?
Yep.
And they had this position called a packer, and basically, because they made plastic bottles, and so this packer, they literally, as it come down to production line, it was almost like Lucille Ball and the Chocolates, right? It was, I'm putting
And now,
right, exactly. It's like I'm putting plastic bottles in a cardboard box every day, right?
yep.
Goggles, hearing protection, isolated, right? And it's just no human interaction, right? And I'm thinking, if you take somebody who's a people person, who's a high eye, who's a real, they've got to have that interaction, and you put them in that position, and you don't benchmark the job, and you don't use assessment tools to figure out the right fit. I said, what's going to happen is, he's going to get written up a whole lot because he's at the water cooler all the time shooting the bull, and the chocolates keep going by. Or B, what's actually happening is this dude will last like 3 weeks. Like, I'm out of here, man. I can't do this. And the churn of the position was horrid. But they realized, hey, if I got somebody that
Sure.
I don't want to be around people, I just want to do my thing. Cool. This is a great job for you, right? And if
And
you have to be around people, this is a horrible job for you.
inept. And I've got a story to prove your point about uh, is it fair to quote put people in a box? Uh,
Mm,
First off, they it's about Rich Carlton, but first of all, the scientists can actually measure. It's called validity coefficients,
mm,
coefficients of validity on different ways for you and I to select people, right? So if we flip a coin, it's zero validity. But if you use a resume, gets you up, it's about a point, almost a point uh, '05.
okay.
If you and I give an interview, um, that's still not very good, but it gets you up to point 0.2. And the reason is we can ferret out some things, but
Right.
people are on their best behavior when they come in to interview you.
Of course.
And you don't know, you can't tell all their beliefs, values, traits, talents in one interview. They're telling you what they think you want to hear. So, anyway, when you start looking at some of these professional assessments, like you were just quoting, then you're way above a point 0.4, which is huge.
Mm,
So here's a story from Rich Carlton. They are one of the they're in a tough business, but it's a very, very well run company. They
yes.
put every manager, every employee through a battery of assessments, and it gets down to the point where they know for people that like to help other people, they should be on the front desk,
Mm,
right? But if they can't cope with not being able to solve somebody's problem, they're real problem solvers, then they can't put them on the front desk because some half the front desk problems are
yeah.
things you can't quite solve. So then they put them in the front of the restaurant to handle
Oh,
that. So anyway,
nice.
this is the story. They gave a battery of tests to all of the housekeeping, the maids, right?
Right.
They spotted one woman that had leadership attributes off the chart. I mean, she's the Colin Powell
Oh,
of
wow.
of maids, and they wisely did the right thing. They didn't put her into management. What they did was they started putting her into some training here and there while she was still a maid. Then they got her a coach. Today, that woman is senior vice president, Ritz-Carlton. So, did they put her in a box? Or were they taking her out of the box by letting her play to her strength?
100%. 100%. That's just music to my ears because you're right. It's all about the whole Jim Collins thing about putting the right people in the right seats of the bus. Well, in a couple of things, I laugh about. I call it just the horrible kabuki dance, right? When you do an interview, right? Exactly. Right? I'm telling you what you want to hear, and I'm asking you. I mean, it's just kabuki theater. I swear to God, it's just complete bunk, right? And to a degree, right? I mean, there's ways to do it. I like there's ways to kind of get around that, but I love the fact that most people that are coming in aren't going to be able to directly articulate, hey, here's my top 7 out of 25 workplace competencies that I'm really the best at. Or, hey, here's the top 4 things that drive my performance, right? That I'm really, that are motivators to me they're not going to articulate that to you. And you're not going to be able to take that from an interview and be able to effectively place them in the job. But you're right. If you can find out basically how they're wired, what attributes they have, what skills they have, something like a Hartman value profile where you're looking at their judgment and how they see the world. When you find those diamonds in the rough like that amongst the maid brigade, you're like, oh my God, we've got an incredible person here. Let's develop this talent, right? And I think it's great. And I love even the idea of, hey, you're a people person, you love it, but you're not a good problem solver, front of the restaurant versus front desk. I'm like, that's just
That's
brilliant. And I
fine.
love that. That little tweak, I love it. Because you're
So
still putting people into strengths.
here's a tip for your viewers where you do need to interview. You still need to interview
Well, of
people,
course.
ferret them out. But this is just a brain trick. To use when you're interviewing somebody, Don't use the future tense if you're asking them a question. Use
Mm,
past tense. Let me explain this. So uh, I'm an old spy. So guess what? Things I've done you will not believe. But on the Strengths Finder scale, my empathy is lower than yours. My empathy, in fact, is the, I don't know, lower third on that
okay.
the scale. Um, so let's say you need somebody to monitor, oversee events, social events, and all that for your company. So you come to me, if you ask me a question in the future tense, hey, Mike, how would you liven up a crowd and fully engage with them when we have salespeople from other companies in and yada yada yada. Well, future tense, my brain works that I can imagine anything.
Right.
And so oh my gosh, are you kidding? I'd have a band there on occasion, and I'd bring donuts in, and I would greet everybody at the door. Uh, in fact, that's not the way I operate, right? So if you ask the question in the past tense, you say, Mike, tell me about a time that you were basically the life of the party, organizing an event so people would have really good times and so on. And now I've got it's reality. I'm going back in memory. And so I
Mm,
sit here and I'm thinking, well, let's see. And my pausing, my hesitation, and my lack of a good story tells you, wait a minute, maybe I need this guy for something else, but I don't need him for this position. So it's just a brain trick. Use past tense, behavioral past tense on these questions, not future tense.
I like that. And you're right. I think most people that have the experience, even if it's tell me a time when you did X, Y, and Z, if they're really good, they can say, well,
They
it
can
wasn't X, Y, Z exactly, but here's the closest thing I had to it. Boom, 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 boom. And I'll tell you one of the best training tips that I could ever say for that, for those behavioral style questions, especially for job interviewing, is Toastmasters
Oh, right.
because of the impromptu speaking. I mean, obviously, you got your prepared speeches and you have your evaluations, and of course, they do the counter or whatever. So you learn how to kind of deal with the what leave it as a silent pause. There's training techniques, but for them to throw a question out and everybody's sitting around the conference table, everybody's there, they're like, "Don't pick me, don't pick me, don't pick me," but they're all thinking about it in case they did. Then all of a sudden, "Hey, Dave, what do you think?" Crap, they picked me, right? And so then you have to go up there and talk like you have two brain cells to rub together for at least 1 minute, right? No more than two. And man,
Alternate bananas or some crazy
well,
thing.
it's funny because there's a lot of like your mind is processing. All right, maybe I slow roll it up to the front, right? I take my time getting up to the front, right? I get up there, maybe I ask the question again. I'm buying time to think of a response. Or you could do what I call just going straight slam politician on them. Thank you, Mike, for asking me about ABC. That is so wonderful. Let me tell you about the virtues of X, Y, and Z. X, Y, and Z is the best thing since sliced bread and the second coming. You're like, you didn't answer the question. Like, exactly. But it's a great training tool to learn how to answer questions on the fly that you don't know what the question's going to be.
Yeah. Amen.
And so I love that. But yes, that is a great technique to do that. And I definitely want to hit more of the chief people officer and some of the Sherman stuff and the leadership stuff with that. But I think this is a great time to go ahead and we'll end this segment of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave, and we will come back and we will hit our first two questions in our next segment. So see you in a bit.
Sounds great.
Welcome back to Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave, where we're here with special guest Mike Mears, and we're going to jump headlong into our first question. So, Mike, what does leadership mean to you, and what does good leadership look like?
Well, Dave, it's interesting. I have for the last 20 years been thinking about leadership in terms of human nature.
Okay.
What makes people tick? Spies have to know what makes people tick. but leaders should too. So when you really start looking into that, then you get into how the human mind works, and there is both good and bad in human nature, as you and I know.
Yeah.
So I think leaders are people that pull out the best of human nature
Mm.
and then apply it toward a mission or goal of their company or whatever. So I see the role of leader as being somebody who can awaken all those people out there and then unleash the best out of them and direct it in the way of the organization. And
Nice.
there's no quote from Eisenhower when he was general that leadership is getting people to do what you want them to do without them knowing it.
Yeah.
Uh, and I would probably add one thing to that. I'd say it's getting people to do what you want them to do without them knowing it and having them enjoy it.
Yeah.
Right?
Having them actually want to do it.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So
Yeah. No, I love that. That's a very, very appropriate quote. I love that. That's and you're absolutely right. I mean, you guys, it's an intentional creation of the environment for people to be able to do their best work.
yeah,
And
absolutely.
well, and like I said, that's one of the things where when you were talking about being the chief people officer, like I said, I've been involved with SHRM for quite a while. President of our local chapter
Oh,
for
right.
well, which I'll give the listeners a word of advice: never take over the president of a chapter or an association or something like that right before a global pandemic. Like that, don't do that.
That's words to the wise.
Oh my God! Well, our past president had ghosted about Q4 of the year when I was president elect, and so kind of had to take over. And then January 2020 comes, and we had 20 some people technically listed on our board, and we had 12 or 13 super actively engaged. The Black Plague rolls into town, and by May, it's me, the treasurer, and a part-time programs person who've been begging to get out of programs for 4 years. And I'm like, don't go anywhere. I swear to God, I know a lot of speakers. Don't go anywhere. So it took a while to build everything back. So I think it was maybe president for 4 years in a row. And then finally, hey, we built our board back. We got things going. We're one of the first associations to actually go back in person. The
Wow.
one of
Yeah.
the a local event center here was we do all of our meetings at the George Washington Hotel. It's a historic like 1920s. It's a Wyndham Grand property and just gorgeous. But I mean, nobody was doing anything in person, and we were like, hey, we want to come back in person. Like, how can we sweeten the pie, right? Just we want to see people physically here, so people are like, oh, if they're doing it, maybe we can start going back in person. And they've been wonderful for us. But yes, it's been as you start going down the SHRM rabbit hole, you realize, wow, one, it's you got SHRM on one side and ATD on the other, for the talent development. It's like, SHRM is a much bigger tent than most people realize. Because I know myself, I heard Society for Human Resource Management. In school, there was a very tight distinction. Here's human resource management on this side, human resource development and organization development on the other side. And the paths never cross. And then I realized that, wait a minute, I know it says human resource management, but realizing, how much of it was talent development, how much of it was recruiting, how much of it was organizational development, and all that stuff. It's like, okay, this is definitely the premier organization for people that deal with people.
Yeah, for sure. Absolutely.
So what about, since we talked about leadership meaning just being able to bring out the best in people and Eisenhower's quote, but what does good leadership look like to you?
When Georgetown had asked me to start up the Leadership Academy, we sat back and we did a study of 200 best leaders.
Mm,
Now this was within CIA, but here's a big secret. Good leadership at CIA is good, like good leadership at any,
anywhere.
it could be Adobe or it could be Salesforce.com. I mean, it's all the same because people are people,
Yes.
human nature. So anyway, we started there, and isolated 200 best leaders as rated by employees, because that's what was important. What did
Now you're
employees?
speaking my language.
And it's I've talked to Gallup about this. It's interesting. If you had to pick a single measure to see if somebody a good leader, it would be unfair because you'd like to use several. But if you
Right.
had to use one, what the employees say is the single best measure. So
Mm.
that's what we used, and so we isolated, and then it was all anonymous, so I didn't have names of these best bosses, but I did have access to the employees that said they had a best boss. And what we did was ask them to the question of why were they your best boss?
Mm.
Well, the brain, human brain operates in terms of narratives, stories, basically.
Oh yeah.
So in every case, the employee comes back, and in some cases they'll give you platitudes like, "Well, she was trustworthy, she had integrity." Well, that's all true, but it's not actionable.
No.
But invariably, they break into a story, and when they do, we collected all these stories and then isolated the behaviors they talked about in the story. And then we took all these best boss behaviors and then started clumping them into different groupings. And I hate to say there's 5 steps to leadership. I mean, we have enough of that stuff. Uh, but what we did, this is what we found out. This was pre 9/11,
Okay.
before 9/11. And we discovered the first step is really make people feel psychologically safe. And that's a big deal now, but it wasn't back then. I think first real work on that wasn't published till 1999. Now you hear
Wow. Yeah, it's
psychologists.
everywhere now, but well, it's groundbreaking at the
Oh,
time.
and what were the behaviors? I mean, they're so basic. It's smiling at people in the morning. It's saying hello to people. I mean, how hard is this stuff? It's not never snapping at them or humiliating them. It's just little things that show you value. So that was the first step. Second
Okay.
step then is trust, build trust, establish trust. Well, how do you do that? Well, you can't do it unless you have safety. Because if I'm afraid of you, I'm never going to trust you completely.
Correct.
I'm off kilter. But so safety, I mean, trust building is simply your consistent behavior. Law of reciprocity kicks in. That's the law of psychology and anthropology, where, for example, if I give you you work for me, I give you little gifts from time to time. I give you positive, I give you praise on occasion. I give you information that helps you. I give you data. I give you training opportunities. These are just little gifts that maybe you wouldn't expect all the time, but
Right.
periodically do it consistently, that builds trust. And then the third step we found was establish clarity. And this is where now that I feel safe with you, I trust you, now my brain is receptive to get what are what are your expectations of me? What are the guide rules? What's your vision? Now I can accept all that.
Mm.
And so establishing clarity with two-way conversations, question asking, all the good stuff, we talk about, that fits in there. And then finally, a fourth step was now that you got the base, now you can push people as hard as you want. Throw in the accountability stuff, but now you're cranking. But if
I love that.
you mess up the steps, and I saw certain CIA directors come in uh, like bulls in china shops and start challenging and berating people. They've lost from they're lost from day one. They're not
Yeah.
going to capture the hearts and minds of the people.
I mean, you're looking at even going back to a popular press book, you look at Maxwell's, 5 levels of leadership, and I've heard some people say, well, the first level really isn't has anything to do with leadership, but I get where they're coming from on it. We splitting hairs, but if it's just positional, like, okay, Mr. Director, yes, you can come in between me and my paycheck, right? You have the ability to fire me. Like that's the only reason I'm listening to you. That's not a strong position to be to come from. It's
Well,
like you said, he kind of it's similar. I follow you because I like you, because I know you, because I trust you, because you're competent. You've like you said, you built those things up, and I love how the research came to those conclusions. Right, you got to have the psychological safety first, and then you build the trust. And once you've done that, and I trust you, and I know that I'm not going to get berated. I'm not going to, you're not going to chew my butt in front of 50 other agents right there and right there at Quantico. Then all of a sudden now it's like, okay, here's the mission, here's the goal, and get the clarity. And then once those are done, you can just then it's literally off to the races. I love that.
and
That is
because
great.
if you're working for the autocrat, I mean that would be let's say a fear-based boss. You are going to do what they tell you to do, but you're not going to do outside that boundary, and you're really not going to go beyond that, which is creativity and innovation. So
Absolutely.
that's what that kind of maniacal micromanaging or autocratic boss does. They kill off the creativity.
You'll get compliance, and that's
There,
it. You'll
there.
you'll and if you're happy with compliance, that's fine. Like you said, you had my hands for 30 years, but you could have had my head if you'd asked, right? You'll get compliance. You just won't get anything else. And you think back to the Q12 engagement study before, you've got I think it was like 32% or a certain percent that's engaged, right? In just textbook definition, hey, I'm doing a little bit more than I have to, above and beyond, giving that extra discretionary effort that I'm not required to. Cool. Set them over to the side. You got about 50, 52%, something like that. I call them clock punchers, right? I come in at 9, I leave at 5, and whatever. It's kind of you'll appreciate this as a chief people officer. Now, after that, I'm not a lawyer and I cannot charge people lots of money to say it depends, right? But I call this the unholy HR contract, right? Yeah, I think they're calling it quiet quitting now or whatever, but it's kind of like I work just hard enough not to get fired and you pay me just enough not to quit.
There you go.
Right. So that's the not engaged people. And then, like you said, yeah, exactly. Then you got the 16%, like I said, that are the actively disengaged that are just, steak, shrimp, and lobster at the cafeteria every day. And it's still not going to be good enough, no matter what you do. But you're right. You're going to end up taking a lot of your engaged employees and shoving them at best into the not engaged. Like I'm just compliant. I come in, I do my 9 to 5, I keep my head under the radar screen. And I've never seen a lot of proactive or creativity or innovation from anybody who's trying to keep their head under the radar screen
I know it. Absolutely.
because of like you said, a micromanagement or an autocratic leader.
Got
And
their hunker down in the trench, right?
exactly, right, right. Right. I'm not gonna put my head up and get shot at, right? I'm gonna literally, like you said, I'm gonna hunker down, check clears every 2 weeks. I got 13 more years until the retirement check comes. I'm just gonna grin and bear it and wait this thing out and just take my beat down until the pension comes and then run like hell.
And there's the loss of well, just the human loss is hurts enough, but the loss of the to the company of the paycheck going to that person that they're not really not providing. But there's another when you get really at the bottom, you get people starting to engage in activities like sticking the paper clip in the copier or stealing from the company, or worse yet, the insider threat. I mean, here we are in cyber world, and you get one person could actually disable a company by doing certain things to the computer system. So that's there's strong business reasons for trying to manage the way you and I are talking as opposed to
100%. It's funny, even if it's not malicious. I remember a healthcare system that I worked for a while back, and their information systems department used to have an audit every year. And they would basically, of course, they train everybody, hey, don't click on suspicious links, don't pick up strange thumb drives and put them in your computer. And they would go around and, of course, they'd hire a company and they would just like, here's a strange hard drive. They just dropped hard drives in different places, all different at the different campuses and stuff. And they would do these things, and they would walk around and they would maybe take a picture of, hey, somebody didn't sign out of their workstation, right? So they got all this HIPAA information up, or it was amazing to find out how many people, no matter how much they trained, were just careless and not compliant. And oh, there's a thumb drive. Let me see what's on it. All right, well, that could have crashed the system. Not being malicious, but not being engaged enough to at least be compliant. Like, hey, I need to look after, hey, this is something that I have been trained on. This is something I shouldn't do. And like I said, you take a whole business down because of somebody just, whatever, and just don't even care to really put that thought into, hey, is this not such the best idea in the world, right?
For sure.
So actually, so let's grab into the second question. What was one of the biggest leadership challenges you've had to face?
Um, I had quite a few. One of them was understanding. I had the spy master at CIA, the deputy of director of operations, asked me a
Okay.
question one time, called me up and asked, uh, Mike, why don't the levers work? And I knew by levers because we'd had a lot of conversations. He was talking about the traditional management levers. You get communications and training and metrics and all that stuff. So first I was embarrassed because I couldn't answer the question, but then I got a little frightened because here's somebody in literally one of the most powerful positions in the world feeling that things aren't working between the top and bottom. Uh,
Mm,
and that was 20 years ago. And since then, I have found armies of CEOs, mid-level managers, and frontline managers who tell me the same thing, that something's not working here.
mm,
I think it's what's not working is our approach, uh, basically is human nature unfriendly in how we lead and manage people in certain areas. Ways we give feedback is some of this stuff is actually medieval. Change.
you mean like the once a year annual appraisal, and that's the only time you get feedback?
Let me tell you something. I work with Dave. I work with about 10, sometimes 11 neuroscientists and psychologists. And to a person, they all agree the worst thing you can do to somebody is create uncertainty in their mind. And you bake that in for 12 months. It's incredible. It's absolutely incredible. So anyway, it was that was from an external point, that was the big shock to me, which has kind of got me on my little, journey here. But for me personally, I would say I discovered really how different we are. And I don't mean when I say different, we're all different in terms of, we talked about traits, personality, all of that. But also there's another function of the brain that makes up narratives.
Mm,
So we get most of our input visually. That's
right.
the that's above all the other senses. And then we're not aware of it. It's unconscious, but the brain makes up a story. So I see Jennifer running over to the copier, and then she dashes off. I go up to the copier, and it's jammed. So my brain saw behavior and now will make up a narrative about Jennifer. See,
Right.
my narrative, being a crusty old spy, is Jennifer is just not a good team player. She's not to be trusted. Uh,
Jennifer jammed up the copier, then ran away.
Copier and then scurried away before somebody else who's normal like you looks at her and says, "Oh, isn't that nice? Jennifer just ran off to get help to fix the copier." So isn't that interesting? The same piece of data, same visual inputs, we're watching behaviors, and you and I have got totally different narratives of what. So here's a story, and I'm not very proud of this one, that tell you a little bit about that. I was walking through the CIA headquarters on the first floor. Uh,
Okay.
this is about 10 years ago, and I see an old employee of mine, Mark. Actually, he had worked with me at the Leadership Academy.
Nice.
And I walk up to him and say, "Mark, how you doing?" And he brightens up and says, "I'm great. I'm doing fantastic." He said, "Finally, I completed my coaching certificate at Georgetown, and now I can go out and I'm coaching people, and I just love it." And I smiled and I said, Mark, that's fantastic. I'm so happy to hear that. And he had this perplexed look on his face. And I said, Mark, what's wrong? And he looked at me and he said, oh, I thought you hated coaching. And I said, what? And he said, yeah, I thought you hated coaching. He said, 15 years ago, I came to your office and asked you, told you that I'd like to take some training on coaching, and you grimaced. In other words, I frowned. Um, and so I ran the tapes back in my head, and I could remember him coming to my office and asking about coaching.
Right.
And I remember I was under a lot of pressure from my boss, who was a micromanager,
Mm,
on getting the executive training done. That was the only one that was off schedule. And Mark was in executive training. So
gotcha.
who's right? Is Mark right? Well, later I found out that actually UCLA's center, neuroscience center,
Yeah.
uh, that Mark is right, because when you have it's called social pain. When you have a bad experience like that with a boss, you retain it longer in memory, more intensely than even physical pain. So Mark was right. But think about that. There were two narratives of that meeting. I had no idea I had crushed this guy's dream, and
Mm,
went on, and then he holds that in his head for 15 years, and I only inadvertently find out about it. So how many times in your leadership day do you
mm.
accidentally do something like that, and the other side's not going to tell you?
Well, and I think you hit the nail on the head. Is it's inadvertent. You have no idea. You just a scowl on your face because of other things that are going on. Now all of a sudden he's reading the room as, oh, wait a minute, he's disapproving of what I'm asking. And you're like, no, no, I'm focused on something else. And like I said, and you're right, the narrative ends up, you know what actually happened as far as your reaction, but how he perceived it and how he took it was totally different. And of course, like you said, that's his reality. Of course, he's like, oh, that's not knowing until you guys had the conversation that no, I never would have
So
said that. I'm glad that you did that. And
that
so it's wild to hear that.
that was my biggest probably issue on your question too, on looking back and mistakes made. And you really have to wonder, how many times have you done something like that? And you know what the antidote is for good leaders? It's all the basic stuff. It's ask questions, get
Right.
feedback, right? Have more one-on-ones, reduce the fear so that sometimes people will give you the work. So it's all those leadership 101, 102 basics again that come into play here.
Yeah, I know I agree 100%. And it's funny you were talking about reducing the fear. Cool story. I there's a regional bank. I say local, but I mean they're all over Virginia. They have some stuff in North Carolina or whatever, but they're based out of Winchester, right? And it's kind of a regional bank. And they've done some recent acquisitions. I think a year or two ago they acquired a bank, a set of banks in Roanoke. They just did one in Richmond. So I mean they're growing, they're expanding. And I remember their chief HR person left and they got a new one and completely different styles. And here was what the cool thing was, got her out to the Sherm chapter. She, getting involved. She's basically coming in from a completely different industry. Was it HR and like automotive or transportation, like nothing to do with banking.
Right.
Now here is the cool part. This was like music to my ears, Mike. I was like, oh God, you're singing my song because it doesn't happen enough. I was, I'm kind of put my feelers out. I go to my local branch, and I know all these people from the bank, from the CEO to some of the tellers, from a lot of chamber events and stuff like that. And I start, putting feelers out. It's 6 months, 8 months, 9 months later, and I've had multiple meetings and conversations and lunch or whatever with this HR person, but I'm kind of curious. I said, hey, what do you guys think about the new HR person? and listening like, oh my God, it's like night and day difference. They were like, normally when HR or a member of management would come around, everybody would run because like somebody's getting fired, right? But now all of a sudden, like they're actually asking us questions. Well, there's tellers different than the branch managers, but it's kind of like they really want to know our opinion, and we give it to them, and she actually uses it, and they're actually trying to do this, this, and this to improve everything. And it was funny listening to how and now HR comes and goes, and like nobody bats an eye. And they actually can have conversations and everything's cool versus why are you asking? What are you doing? Like, why are you here? What are you doing in my branch? You know what I mean? It's just completely, it made the psychological safety, like you were saying. And so then all of a sudden, like I said, and she built the layer of trust, just like on your model, right? And now they're realizing I really do care about what's going on and we're trying to make this a better place, right? So like I said they got the clarity involved. And like I said, it's soon getting to the point that, like I said, they're going to ramp everything up. But she spent a lot building that trust. And it was really cool to hear that from the frontline tellers and the branch managers on how things were going from, the top down from the corporate HR folks. It was nice to, run into the CEO at a chamber event and said, hey, let me, you open for a little bit of feedback? Yeah. Let me tell you all this great stuff that your tellers and branch managers and your frontline staff are telling me about your new HR person. And it was, did her a solid, man. He was tickled. He was like, that's awesome feedback. I wouldn't have gotten. He said, yeah, it was really cool to see how she's been turning things around. And I think leaders can do the exact same thing. It was just a good example of a traditional position that doesn't foster a god awful amount of trust. Let's just say.
Well, yeah, I just scratched down my notes with that story because what I like about that is the leader asked, you said, use the word opinions. He asked for their opinions. That's what's in their head, right? Not the leader didn't come in and just ask for facts, like how many accounts closed, whatever. That if you ask fact-based questions, which you need to do, but if you do that, you're really sending a signal that this person maybe is a robot or like a tape recorder or something.
Yeah.
To start asking somebody's opinion and listening actively or intently really shows you value that other person. So think about what that does in the employees' minds when they go through and do that's a cool story.
Exactly. Yes. And it was kind of heartwarming. And like I said, I was rooting for the new person anyway. Because as soon as she started, I was like, hey, let's grab lunch, tell about the local SHRM chapter, tell me about yourself. Because I knew all the people that were at the bank, as far as executive leadership. I just didn't obviously know her because she was brand new, but it was such a pivotal role. And I knew the last HR person quite well. And it was really cool to see and to hear the feedback from the frontline staff be so positive. And I was like, okay, this is one thing that, to do you a favor. It's like, let me drop this, compliment on the feedback that I heard to her boss, the CEO, and he loved it. And
We all
so,
get
like I said, that was just yeah, he thought it was fantastic. And I was like, okay, I said, in some way, shape, or form, this is how it's supposed to work. Not typically how it does work, unfortunately. But yeah, no, that's definitely hit the nail on the head on some of those. But it's funny when you mentioned your framework, I could go back and look to see what she did, and it was almost the exact step by step of the exact framework you talked about.
you got to rework it all the time and they're mixed together, but you're right. That's you really got to have the safety and then you build your trust. So
Yeah, and at some degree, I mean, as going back to those 5 levels of leadership for Maxwell's book, it kind of it's like a cross between there and the situational leadership models. Like we're at different levels with different people all the time. You may have somebody that you could push, 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 and you got somebody that's brand new that you're just starting to lay the foundations for the psychological safety. And everybody that you're dealing with that's underneath of you is probably somewhere in between.
that's the tricky part of leadership. I stay up with the human nature, how we're all alike, but once you get that down, because you can't violate human nature,
Right.
then you got to get in and like you say, now you're doing it based on the individual because the individuals are different, have different needs, different experiences, different strengths, and yeah, that's where it gets tricky. Know your
Yes.
people.
You have to know your people. And if you have a larger organization, you might not be able to know everybody, but you know your direct reports. And you
Yeah,
create the environment that you make the expectation they know their direct reports. And
mhm.
that's how it should work. So on and on down to the frontline staff. If everybody knows the 6, 7, 8, 9 people, whatever that are reporting specifically to them, and they know them really well, they're doing the constant updates and how things going and little 5 minute, how things going at work, blah blah blah. Those little touch points. Then there isn't a surprise when it comes to the annual review. It shouldn't be an annual review anyway, but that's a whole other podcast. But but as I've had them before where, wow, that happened almost a year ago. If you'd have mentioned that almost a year ago, I could have changed that, fixed that. I didn't know that was something that you didn't like. Right? That would have been really good to know a year ago before I got dinged on my on my evaluation. Now,
Absolutely.
not happy camper whatsoever. So there's definitely ways to improve that type of process. But I think this is a good spot to end this segment. And so we'll be back with conversations on leadership with Dr. Dave, and we will hit the last two questions in just a moment. Welcome back to our final segment of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. We're here with Mike Mears. So, Mike, let's jump into the last two questions and wrap up this podcast. So, what do you see as one of the biggest mistakes leaders make today?
I would say overall, not taking human nature into account as they
Mm,
apply um, their leadership theory or the various management. We talked about levers earlier, various management levers and whatnot. Um, but uh, I'll go off to the side for a little bit because I feel
sure.
sorry for leaders today. I sit in the happy position of being a consultant, teacher, trainer, writer, but I look at people that are uh, actually in leadership positions today, and I see them more overloaded than we were 20, 30 years ago. And the
Mm,
cause of it is actually the technology that's supposed to be helping us. I was around when computers first came in and they were going to save us time. Well, they didn't, did they? And then the internet came and it was going to save us time. Well, it didn't. It sped up the gerbil wheel.
yeah.
And then we've got email piling on and God forbid today chat, which is immediate and always there. And so when I go around speaking foreign places, US, it doesn't matter. I'll ask the managers there. I'll say, how much of your day is spent on in meetings and in email? And it's fascinating because they throw different numbers around and they coalesce on average to 85% of their day is spent on email and meetings. Well, that this is not scientific, but that number leaves very little time for people to reflect. Managers need to sit back and think big thoughts, think about how they're going to work with their people. They've got to do some type of pre-planning. They need time for relationships. My goodness, to have more linkages with the people. Otherwise, you end up with a pretty sterile environment. So I would say managers today are really up against the wall, and somehow that is sort of an answer to your question on mistakes made because we're not breaking loose from that enough to give
Mm,
us enough time to do the old soft stuff, the people stuff, the relationship stuff. Um, and I, but in specifically in answering, if I look at the big picture, your question of where people are going awry, I would say especially CEOs on change management. They're using a lot of brain-friendly techniques or easier ways to do change management. And then the other one is something you and I have talked about offline, which is selection of leaders in an organization is so important. And what happens is I see people, CEOs or in government division chiefs, making decisions of hiring, say, frontline managers, and they say, "I'm hiring for people that can do the mission skills
Right.
and people with people skills." Well, that's something they say, but I've gone back and done studies, and what happens is it's actually a cognitive bias. They end up going, the bias is toward the mission skills,
Yep.
and they're not
100%.
and they're not selecting. So what does that mean? Well, it means about half the people that you're hiring will have people skills, and that unit's going to function really well, but half of them don't. They've got the technical skills, but they might be abrasive, they might be micromanagers, they might be
Mm.
autocrats, whatever. And that's the unit that you're going to have the problems in. That's the unit's not going to perform as well. So you're baking it in the cake. Uh, you and I were talking offline, and you've mentioned that Gallup number, 70% of the performance basically is the boss.
Yeah.
The boss is a great boss or the most hard boss you've ever had. And so that decision is the single most important decision I think managers make. Who are they going to hire for new managers? Um, and much more important than my job's to develop future leaders. You've heard that. Everybody thinks that's the biggest job. It's not. It's to select those. Then you develop.
Yeah.
Make a mistake on the selection, you're in big trouble.
I would agree with that 100% because there is a bias to the skills. And I've heard a lot of folks say, "Hey, I hire for attitude. I hire for the people skills, and you can always train the skills." But there are very specific jobs to where you have to have the technical proficiency, obviously, to be able to do the job, if you, especially if you're managing it, to a certain degree. But you're right, that candidate selection and how their leadership style, their leadership traits, how they communicate with people, like I said, their competencies, how they just them dealing with people in general. I mean, that's crucial. And if you're not having either I pick that up in the interview or I have some sort of third party tool like an assessment suite or something that dials me in on, hey, where are they at with this? Like you were talking about with Ritz Carlton. Oh my God, we just identified this person has great leadership skills versus I'm interviewing somebody coming in and I'm using this as a piece of the selection process along with a resume, a couple of interviews, so on and so forth. I can look at this and figure out, all right, do they have the requisite skills in the things that are going to be very difficult to pull out when it comes to an interview? Because, like you said, they're answering the questions that the way they think you want them answered. Um, if you have a good assessment tool that's very sensitive to that, it's funny how you can go back and look at the actual responses on the tool and realize, hey, wow, look at the data, and they're like, okay, this isn't natural, right? And so you end up having to pull it, and they're like, hey, they answered the assessment tool, and they gamed the system, and they answered the questions how they thought you wanted them answered. We did that with an executive selection committee one time, and I went back to him, and it was their number one on the list. The guy, oh my God, this guy's great. He's a professor. Oh, we want this is the guy we want. And I called our research department for where I get my tools, and I'm like, hey, man, this does not look right. This does not make sense. I'm not getting the warm fuzzies. And they went back and looked on the back end, and they're like, well, yeah, because I bet the paycheck on it right now that this guy, I'm showing you what the guy answered the questions how he thought they wanted to be answered, and he gamed it. So I went back to him. I'm like, hire whoever you want. My check is already cleared. I'm like, but if they'll lie, I said, I'm relaying a message to you from the research department from the assessment company. If he'll lie to you about this, dot, 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 fill in the blanks. And they were like, didn't think about it that way. Like,
And isn't it, I laugh because you're talking about the glee at which the committee lit up saying this is the person. So here's a quick story.
yep.
What is the most secretive organization headquartered in McLean, Virginia? If you say CIA, I'll say wrong because it's Mars Candy. Mars Candy is a privately held company that doesn't even mark its front door. It is an amazing company. But let's say Mars has one M&M blemished out of every 10,000. They
Right.
will stop the line. They will do some type of analysis. They'll do process improvement to make sure they don't get one bad M&M.
Wow.
Now, however, you go into any other organization and you do the same thing. Instead of a blemished M&M, you look at the bad manager in that organization. Nobody ever asked the question, who hired that bad manager? Not to assign blame to the committee, but to just say that again, the validity that they were using wasn't up to snuff. So overall, when I do draw numbers out of clients, what I find is every organization, not every, but almost every organization has got between 15% to 25% poor and awful bosses.
Mm.
That's that's terrible because those people are doing such disproportionate damage. And nobody, though, steps back and says, well, wait a minute, who selected those? What was the process used to select? Let's fix that. And so if one M&M in 10,000 is important, surely one bad boss out of
Exactly. Well, and it's funny you mentioned that because the first thing that come to my mind was I worked for an organization one time that they hired a department head, right? And there's a CEO and VPs and then the department heads. Well, they hired a department head and they let's just say the person who showed up for the interview wasn't the person who showed up for the job. This guy
yeah,
was like Babe Ruth for the interview, like
yep.
425 over the left field wall, right? I mean, it was amazing. The guy who showed up was a little squirrely dude. Is like, where did Babe Ruth go? Right? We hired him. Like, why is it? But the problem is like, well, and he was basically, for lack of a better term, burning the place down. Right? It was awful. People leaving, turnover leaving, engagement through in the toilet. I mean, it was awful. And we were complaining, and they were like, "Well, we always give everybody 2 years, blah 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 blah." What it was not their fault. They made a bad hiring decision. The problem ended up being they weren't willing to eat the crow to realize, hey, we made a bad hire. We need to cut this guy because he's doing us damage. So to satisfy their own ego, they ended up keeping the guy on for an extended period of time that they shouldn't have, and it just caused all kinds of issues, and it lost a lot of good people with that. But with that, actually, let me get into the last question here as we wrap up. What do you think is the best way for leaders to improve their leadership skills?
I'll give you a little menu.
Sure.
And first one is the easiest thing you can do in leadership that if I had my life to live over again, I would have done 8 times more. And it is simply give more positive feedback.
Mm,
Uh, when I was, because I've been actually, we can talk more about it, but I've been working with neuroscientists and Gallup and some psychologists on what positive feedback does to the brain. And we can get into that. That's fascinating. But what's interesting is in my mind, I thought my A players knew they were A players. I don't have to, I don't have to tell them, hey, you're doing a great job. You're doing a great job. They know that. Well, they
or do
don't.
they?
No, they're people, right? We all want to know where we stand. It's this whole thing we have with uncertainty. We want to know where we stand, and hearing it frequently from a boss is and some people push back and they say, "Oh, I can't give somebody weekly positive feedback because they'll think I'm a sap, that I'm too soft." Well, I asked three uh, psychologists at Gallup that question: How many times can you give somebody positive feedback before uh, they start to think it's insincere?
Right.
And one of them said, I love this answer, maybe 30 times. The other two said infinite. So
Wow.
there's a dispute among, but look at that. That means that you could just, on a weekly basis, give somebody positive feedback, re energize them, take all the doubt out of their mind, establish that psychological safety, and they're going to be a much more productive. And it's so easy. How long did it take me to do it? 5 seconds, 6 seconds to give the feedback walking in the hallway, or
Yeah.
stopping at the desk, or picking up the phone if they're virtual and just saying, "Hey, just wanted you to know you did a super job on that XYZ report." Um, it 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 doesn't cost anything to do it, and it gives you the most results. In talking with Gallup, this is kind of interesting. It looks like to me uh, that one spot of positive feedback, it degrades, it like depreciation over a
Right.
period of time. It looks like it kind of gets you through a week. And then the uncertainties, and is my boss mad at me, and are my colleagues, do they like me? All that crazy stuff that's unconscious
Right.
starts to rise up. But I think that would be the number one thing I would say is don't do what I did. Uh, do basically what I'm saying, and start kicking in that positive feedback. And then
I might I
two,
might have an answer for the psychologist. I might
yeah,
actually have an answer for that one. Like how much is too much?
yeah.
When it actually starts coming across as when you're not being authentic and you are being insincere and it comes across as inauthentic and insincere. At that point, it's too much. But if it's legitimate and it's authentic and it's sincere in its delivery, then I agree with the psychologist 100%. It's almost you can't do it enough. It becomes too much when they can tell like why were they saying that? Like I didn't do anything that you're right when it is insincere and not authentic to them.
Two more tips, I think. I like that. Two more tips would be make sure you link it to their work,
Right.
because they're going to do it more, right?
Yep.
And two, make sure it literally is a valid thing to praise for. And
Correct.
it's the trick. Sometimes, if you're a frontline manager and you're running, you got 8, 10 people, you may not know what to praise person. Let's say Juanita over here. You don't know what to praise her for that week. Well, there's a simple question when you're doing a check-in or a swing by. You just say, Juanita, what are you proudest of doing this week? That's a pretty cool question, isn't it?
That's
So
not
she
bad. I like that.
she answers, and that's something you didn't know she did. You don't know all the good stuff your employees do. And then you give it back to her, a legitimate at a girl that she may go home and tell her spouse, the boy, hey, guess what the boss said today?
Well,
That's
that's
pretty
awesome.
ring the bell.
I absolutely love that because, like I said, you don't know, and you're like, I don't know what to compliment her on. Hey, what are you most proud of this week you've done? And then they tell you, you're like, oh wow, that's really cool. Hey, great job. And so, like I said, then you are able to, like I said, give some sincere feedback because, hey, that's something that's really cool that I didn't even realize. Thank you for telling me. I love that idea because that is probably, I would think, the number one question that people would have is, I don't know what to compliment them on because I don't see everything that they do, and I'm having a hard time. And you don't want to compliment them on something that's not work related, that is not going to incentivize them to continue to do the good work that they're doing. So I love that. That's a great one. I think everybody ought to uh, use that one. That's fantastic. So with that,
Go
we'll
ahead.
what's that?
Go ahead.
I was to say we'll wrap this up. Let's tell our listeners how they can connect with you. How can they website, LinkedIn, however. Basically, they were just like, all right, I got to wrap up all this, Mike Mears goodness, and I got to get more of this, man. How do they make that happen?
So I guess we'll keep it simple. Uh, my name is Mike Mears, Mears.
Mhm.
So they can go to mikemears.com. That's a website, but it's easiest to get me on LinkedIn. Look up Mike Mears, and please, everybody just link up with me. I've got all kinds of I'm at the give back stage of life, so I got all kinds of fun goodies I can pass along to you. I got a free uh, bi-monthly newsletter format
Nice.
if anybody wants that. Most of all, though, I'm so excited, Dave, I've got a book coming out in January 28th. And the title of the book is Certainty, and based on a lot on neuroscience, but it's a fun book, a lot of CIA stories and good leadership stuff. It's Certainty: How Great Bosses Can Change Minds and drive innovation. So I hope people will, you're better than me if you write that down and look January 28th to buy the book. But
Well, hopefully they can go on Amazon and pre-order or something like that. Maybe there's a way they can pre-order the book. I
I
know
think
that's
they don't have the pre-order set up yet. So
oh,
I will
oh,
send you and them a bunch of gifts January 28th or 29th with a little thing attached on if they want to hit it to buy the
that
book.
that works for me. And other than that, we'll have different links, like I said, to your LinkedIn and the website there in the description. So with that, thank you so much, Mike. And that is it for this episode of Conversations on Leadership with Dr. Dave. We will see you all next time. Take care.